Hello, and welcome to Commendable Commotion, where the creative arts intersect with their sinister cousins, true crime and parapolitics. Today we have a very special guest, Dr. Alexander Reid Ross from Portland State University in Oregon. He's going to walk us through a very unusual period in Italian history, known in Italian as Gli anni di piombo, and that's the years of lead in English. Alexander runs a very in depth podcast about this particular topic. His podcast is aptly titled The Years of Lead Podcast. We're also going to talk about a couple of filmmakers who have made some very interesting movies related to the Italian years of lead in one way or another. I personally was very pleased to see that Alexander is giving this topic so much attention outside of Italy, as it is a very dark, mysterious, but important period of Cold War history. So, without further ado, let us begin. So, Dr. Reid Ross, for people unfamiliar, who are you and what do you do? Before we talk about your magnificent Years of Lead podcast, what sort of work do you do outside of your podcast?
I teach geography at Portland State University, looking mostly at the intersection between human and natural systems. And I research the far right. I'm on the executive committee of the Far Right Analysis Network. And I also do work investigating disinformation with the Network Contagion Research Institute. So those are kind of the three hats that I wear.
That's uh, that's a lot of hats. So you must be busy.
I'm from Texas, so that I hide them all under my 10-gallon hat.
Yeah, yeah. Did that did doing that influence you making the Years of Lead podcast? It sounds kind of similar, the whole kind of topic.
I think the Years of Lead Pod was inspired by my time as an activist and my kind of desire after 2020 to do a kind of retrospective soul searching in terms of social movement strategy based on the years of lead in Italy as a sort of historical analog to the political violence that we were experiencing at the time. So I wanted to see, because, obviously new social movements are very influenced by events that took place in Italy in the 1970s. Um, Autonomia and the social theories of people like Tony Negri. And so I wanted to explore that and to think about like what went wrong back then and how can we avoid that in the present.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, so like before we touch on that a bit more, for people unfamiliar, would you be able to describe just briefly what the Years of Lead were, or Gli anni di piombo, as it is in Italian? What were the Years of Lead?
Different things to different people, right? It was a period of a lot of political violence between the left, the right, and the state, with a lot of blurred lines about political identities. And we're talking about a window that some people call the long 1970s of Italy, from 1967 to 1982, roughly speaking, a period of time that
Yeah.
began with widespread student occupations in 1967 and sort of ended in 1982 with the breakup of the Red Brigades, um, the leading armed group of the left wing. So other people will contextualize it more within the late 1960s through the emergence of something called armed spontaneity, when you really saw political violence kind of devolve into street wars, murder gangs, and basically just kind of chaos. Kind of more from 1976 to 1982. But the criticism of that is that people who contextualize it with that small frame often focus on left-wing violence because that was a period when the left-wing violence had really taken off and accelerated. But when you expand the time frame to include the late 60s, early 70s, then you have to reckon with the extent of right-wing terrorism linked to functions of the state and the way that it provoked kind of mass insurrectionary uprisings throughout Italy and kind of precipitated the vast armed movement of the late 1970s. So you can kind of contextualize it either way, from 67 or from 76. But either way, the term Anni di Piombo is really kind of a phrase that evokes political violence and tensions.
So is that the strategy of tension? What you mentioned just there about the kind of provocation of violence and that kind of thing from certain groups back then. Is that the strategy of tension that you talk about in your podcast, or is that something different in that period?
I certainly do talk about the strategy of tension, which really emerges in a kind of more articulate form in the mid 1960s out of counter what was kind of emerging as counterinsurgency doctrine, small wars, anti-communist sort of paramilitary strategies, and especially what was then really counterintelligence, right? Which included psychological operations. So
Yeah.
in 1965, there's a big conference in Rome's Parco dei Principi Hotel, where you have some major players from the extreme right, from fascist groups, violent fascist groups, sort of mingling with members of the state, the security apparatus in Italy, people tied to NATO, and people involved in psychological operations, and like Maji Brodsky, and they sort of deliver these talks about uh, uprooting communism in Italy, because Italy had the largest communist party in the whole of Western Europe. So at this
Yeah.
conference, they really kind of flesh out this strategy that is now called the strategy of tension, which describes the creation of chaos within society through political operations such as false flag bombings to make it look like the left wing is actually devastating these infrastructure targets and banks and things like that, so that people will drift away from the Communist Party and towards what they would term a state of order, which they kind of broke down as to what that really entailed, right? So you have an anti-communist alliance that sort of accumulates in the mid 1960s, and they know that what they want to do is sort of set the left up to fail, but they don't really know what they'll do, as an alternative. Some of them want to create a fascist state. Some of them want to create like a de Gaulle style presidentialist state. And then others just want to support the centrist party, the Christian democracy. And those groups, though, end up sort of like supporting a paramilitary fascist organization called Ordine Nuovo, which is responsible for a number of bombings that caused a significant civilian death toll from 1969 to 1974. Conveniently, the Nixon administration, more or less. And the objective would be to try to make the left the patsy for right-wing violence in order to turn society against socialism and communism, and cement this sort of authoritarian state order. So that's the strategy of tension.
And I'm just thinking like, the whole idea of particularly for people who may not have read anything about this period in Italian history, the whole idea of like false flag bombings by, certain actors and that kind of thing to pin it on other people, as it were, other political groups. I mean, it sounds bizarre. I mean, it is bizarre, but like so many people would think, what? How on earth could that have happened? No way. Conspiracy theory, as some would say. What sources do you use when you make your Years of Lead podcast? Like, what reliable sources can people find about that?
Oh, in English, definitely. I think that the big three would be Jeffrey Bale's Darkest Sides of History. Is that right? Darkest Sides of.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's what it's called.
think so.
I haven't opened it in a little while, but Anna Cento Bull's book on Italian neo-fascism is excellent, and Ferraresi's book about democracy in Italy is also excellent. So those would be the three, I think, most important English language texts to kind of wrap your head around um, the complex formations that were emerging and that kind of intertwined in these kinds of really interesting and often fractious ways.
Yeah. Okay, that's good. And so in terms of, the potential state actors' involvement, would you be able to expand a little bit on that? Because that's one of the most kind of strange and bizarre, murky areas of this whole period.
Yeah,
And again, what sources, same sources, would they talk about that as well, the books you mentioned?
they would. However, if you want the involvement of the United States, there's an excellent journal article that was published this year by a professor in Rome, um, in the journal Diplomacy and Statecraft, and it's about the involvement of United States intelligence services in constructing and developing the strategy of tension in Italy after World War II. Um, the thing about it is that you have to understand that the United States was occupying a country that had been, more than 20 years of fascist regime, right? So it was extraordinarily complicated, um, for the United States to kind of develop confidence in Italy's capacity to self-govern as a democratic state, which was the idea of, kind of developing post-war Europe. The United States created the Marshall Plan, not because it was feeling like, happy-go-lucky, we want to like, give a bunch of charity to the Europeans, but because the United States wanted Europe to reconstruct after the war along the lines of, a capitalist democracy with a strong centrist, position. And the Marshall Plan was a way of kind of luring Europeans away from the Soviets because the
Yeah.
US was terrified of communism in Europe. And so were a lot of people in Europe. More even than being terrified of communism, they were afraid of the Soviets and they were afraid of Soviet, authoritarianism, which wasn't, was not necessarily, you know, an ill-placed fear because, as the Soviets
Yeah.
showed pretty early on in Czechoslovakia, they had no compunction about overthrowing left-wing socialist governments that were more democratic than they even preferred, you know. And so immediately with the power of the Italian Communist Party, which played the biggest role in the partisan resistance against the fascists from 43 to 45, you have this sort of bifurcation of Italian society between the Communist Party and the centrists who were more in line with the United States. And then you have fractures within the centrist party, the Christian democracy, over whether or not you should be pro-West or whether Italy should have an independent presence that is sort of grounded in its existence within the Mediterranean. This was Aldo Moro, for example. Um,
Mm.
so you have these different sort of factions within the Christian democracy. There's complicated relationships with other parties that were supported by the United States, like the Social Democrats. Um, and then there's also the Socialist Party, which is sort of conflicting after 48 with the Communist Party. And so it's a very complicated political scene. And the United States was was also afraid of an invasion from Yugoslavia, which was a communist state as well after the war. And so they, kind of they created this network that they called the Stay Behind Network of mostly monarchist and right-wing kind of reactionary liberals or even some former fascists who would be kind of the first line of defense in the event of or I shouldn't say the first line of defense. They would be the ones who would conduct partisan operations in the event of a Yugoslav occupation, right? So
Yeah.
the US created this. It was partly involving the CIA, but more than that, there was also a network that was called the Los Angeles Network, which was developed by the Pentagon's military intelligence. And the Los Angeles network included a group called the FAR, the Fasci di Azione Rivoluzionaria. And this was clearly a fascist organization that was built out of people who had been more or less accomplices to Mussolini's regime, true believers in fascism, going around committing acts of violence and like firebombing, Communist Party headquarters and things like that. And the Pentagon was actually supporting this group as part of what it called the Los Angeles Network in order to try to subvert the Communist Party, particularly in 47 and 48, when it really looked like the communists were about to take power in elections, through the elections. The Los Angeles network kind of stuck around for a little while. I think it was shuttered in 54, which was around the exact time that you see Ordine Nuovo, the fascist paramilitary group, emerge, led by some people who had been involved in the FAR and other fascist formations. So, like the Black Legion, Clemente Graziani was involved in that one. So you have these different fascist organizations that emerge and are kind of supported by the Pentagon after World War II in order to fight against the Communist Party. And splinters of those formations end up becoming the Ordine Nuovo in the 1950s, which then goes on to participate in these sort of shady networks of Italian secret services and sort of, fascist paramilitaries who are trying to undermine the left, and that is sort of like the secret history of post-war Italy, which is sort of obscure, but it really sets the stage for all of the violence that takes place from 69 to 82. And yeah, the strategy of tension sort of becomes a kind of a sort of implied secret policy from, 65 and forward past there. Um, I don't know if I answered your question at all, but
No, you did, you did, you did.
so
It's
that
all
article that I was talking
super.
about is Niccolò Petrelli from the strategic studies. Um, he's an assistant professor of strategic studies from the Department of Political Science. Uh, and that,
Perfect.
yeah, that article is published in a peer-reviewed journal. It's excellent.
Wonderful. Yeah, do send that on. I'll put a link to it in the description of this. Now, in terms of those violent incidents that happened during the years of lead, there are many. They were very tragic. They're horrible. Anyone can read about them. Anyone can listen to your podcast to learn about them. Can you give an example of one of those tragic incidents, one that really jumps to your mind immediately? I mean, whether it's Banco Ambrosiano massacre, whether it's the Bologna train bombing of 1982, they're all equally tragic. What one jumps out to you immediately as like being one of the most brutal and just most strange and murky of those incidents?
Well, Banco Ambrosiano was not a massacre. First of all, that was a very rigidly conservative and Catholic bank based in Milan, named after Saint Ambrose, the patron saint of Milan, which ended up getting kind of taken over by these mafia-linked groups that steered it into the Vatican Bank and created a whole international network of shell companies used to launder money, in some cases, perhaps from the heroin and cocaine trade. Um, and the main person behind that uh, in Banco Ambrosiano ended up getting or ended up at the end of a rope hanging from Blackfriar Bridge in London uh, while he was
Roberto
on the run
Calvi.
from the same people he was collaborating with. So that's one crazy, crazy story that's extremely fascinating. And then the Bologna massacre took place in 1980. Was truly awful. I think 80 people were killed in that particular massacre, which remains shrouded in mystery to this day, partly because the culprits um, have admitted to numerous um, bombings, or not, excuse me, not bombings, numerous murders, but they remain to this day very staunch in their denial that they had anything to do with it. So this causes a lot of problems for people who are like, well, they're admitting so much, but they're not admitting this one thing, right?
Yeah.
The quantity of people who were killed in that massacre makes it probably the biggest trauma of the period for Italians. Bologna is a left-wing city, um, viewed as one of the top sort of partisan, you know, uh, heroes, if cities can be heroes, of the Italian resistance, up there with Genoa.
Yeah.
Um, and it was specifically targeted by fascist terrorists several times specifically because of that sort of left-wing nature. It was sort of known as Red Bologna. It had a
Yeah.
communist mayor, and it was sort of the avant-garde of the left. There were, brilliant journals and radio stations and all of this sort of incredible art going on in Bologna at the university among the students, and then just in sort of like the social movements. Bologna had been the site of massive protests in 1977 which were sparked by a police killing of a protester, and it was sort of seen as a site of the new resistance, not just the original resistance from 43 to 45, but the new resistance against this sort of stodgy old guard of the Christian democracy who paraded around their anti-fascist and democratic credentials, but only ever sort of sank the country deeper and deeper into inflation and despair. And so Bologna was like seen as a sort of the renaissance of Italian hope, you know? And the bombing was just a real punch in the face for, the whole country really, because while the country was bitterly divided during that period, through violence and hatred and rancor, there are things that, people can still sort of agree about and come together and recognize sort of conviviality,
Yeah.
and to bomb a train station, and they put the bomb in the second class waiting room, just to really get as many people as possible. It was just such a horrible thing for people to have to deal with. And that one, after years and years of these kinds of bombings, I think that one was just the straw that kind of broke the camel's back in many ways. It was more emotional perhaps than all the other ones. I don't know though. That's sort of my take on that. Um,
Yeah, no, that's interesting. And certainly, I mean, it does kind of mark for some people like kind of one of the last gasps of the years of lead, certainly in the early 80s, as well as the Red Brigades, disbanding around that time, I think, as you mentioned earlier. Um, so in terms of like, speaking of Bologna, I know that the writer Pier Paolo Pasolini is sort of associated with the city of Bologna. Uh, you did an episode on your podcast about his death, which is still quite murky and mysterious, like the Bologna bombing itself. Um, Before we talk a little bit about your episode on Pasolini, were you a fan of Pasolini's films or his books or anything like that beforehand?
Beforehand, I was a big fan of some of his poems.
Yeah.
Tears of an Excavator is one of the best poems ever written, in my opinion. Um, and I don't know. Let me think. I'm trying to think about some of the films that he did.
Do you ever see the Gospel according to Saint Matthew?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, I did see that one. I don't know. I have kind of a short attention span. Not for my own talking. I can talk for a long time, but for generally for like movies and things. And that's one that kind of moves quite slowly and is deliberately sort of designed to sort of slow things down, I think.
Yeah,
Um, it's very, very austere, you know? And
exactly.
so there's parts of it that I love and parts that I don't. Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, and I mean that's I guess what my take on Pasolini would be really is that there's some things about him that I think are really awesome. And then there's other things that I'm like, I really don't like that at all,
And how
but
did you go about how did you go about researching, like, for your episode on his murder in 1975 in Ostia, which for those who
yeah.
don't know is just outside Rome. It's a lovely sort of coastal resort basically. Um what like I mean, how did you go about researching his death, given like potentially a language barrier and a lot of the stuff written about his murder, particularly in Italian? Do you speak Italian for those unfamiliar? No?
No, 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 no. I do not speak Italian. I've tried a few times on the episode to say Italian sentences and things, and almost always hilariously fail. Um, because I live in Portland, Oregon, and I've been to Italy, but I've not stayed there for long enough to actually sort of converse congenially and regularly enough to actually, have the language kind of stick in any kind of fluent way at all. Um, I think when I was researching the Pasolini episode, I was reading this book, Profondo Nero, that we were talking about a little bit earlier.
Yeah,
Um, and that's sort of like, you know, a mixture of me kind of fumbling through reading these texts because I read Spanish pretty well. So I
yeah.
like converted to Italian with some difficulty, and I've sort of stuck with it to the extent that I'm able to sort of blunder my way through. Um, and then when I find crucial nuggets and I'm like that, I should like quote that or like fix on that, then I'll like double check with like Google Translator just to make absolutely sure that I'm not, out of my mind or whatever. So I'm cheating. That's an important the important thing to know. I'm a
I
total
use
fraud.
the Google Translate. I use all the time if I'm stuck with something. But how does his death fit into the years of lead and all the bizarre things we've been talking about? In terms of the, murky political violence, sometimes with state affiliated actors. How does his death fit into that weird stuff? Briefly, if you could explain.
Well, I think that, you know, as we were kind of saying earlier during our conversation, Pasolini was a complicated figure even for his time. He was gay, he was a committed communist, um, after having been sort of an idealistic fascist youth, um, which is something that you can hardly blame kids for growing up in 20 years of a fascist regime. But he became a communist and a committed one. But the Communist Party more or less expelled him because he was gay and they couldn't really cover up for him. Also, he liked younger men, let's put it that way, which it was extremely embarrassing for them, for the party. And so he became kind of this weirdly like culturally conservative communist outside of the Communist Party, but always loving the Communist Party and believing that that the Communist Party, if I remember his statement correctly, represented a pure country in a corrupt one. That the Communist Party was basically a doorway to a whole new country based in principles and honor, you know. But he also was sort of he also loved Catholicism, and Catholic Italy. He deeply loved uh the south of Italy, which is
Yeah.
poorer and like has different kind of times and rhythms than northern Italy, dialects and all of that kind of thing. He also loved the differences that Italians had, right? And sometimes was a little bit anti-Italy in the sense that he didn't like this sort of monotonous pull towards industrial modernism that was sort of paving over all the differences between, special Italian dialects. He loved his Friulian dialects, from the northeast of Italy. And he wrote in them, he wrote in dialects as a poet and a very respected poet. And he was also a very respected filmmaker. I mean, he made a number of films, and political figures like Aldo Moro were like photographed attending his screenings and things like that. He was great friends with Maria Callas, the great opera singer. And,
Yeah.
it seems like all the intellectuals who met him fell in love with him immediately. Um, and by the mid 70s, despite his many, many, many scandals, he became a kind of public celebrity who had a column in the Corriere della Sera, which was more or less the equivalent of the Italian New York Times. And he
Yeah.
used it as sort of like a podium to express his kind of deeply conservative left-wing ideas. Like, for example, in 1969, when the riot police fought against students at Valle Giulia, in Rome at Sapienza, the university. He said, I'm on the side of the riot police because they have to go home to their families and make money and make a wage, and they know what it really means to be a worker. The kids on the street are coming in out of college, and they're the children of their daddy's little boys, basically, is what he calls them. Figli di papi, right? So, this caused a huge stir and many people, radical leftists, denounced him. And by, 74 or 75, he was writing columns in the Corriere della Sera opposing divorce, saying, divorce is just a continual part of sort of society. It's like a pressure release valve instead of a social revolution, you know? But it was still kind of, it worked for conservatives in a weird way, right? So he was kind of this interesting figure, as many figures during that period are very interesting when you kind of analyze them as sort of three-dimensional characters. And his last column was a sort of bizarre and semi-paranoid address to the Italian Republic saying, I know where the bodies are buried, basically, looking at massacres that had been occurring over the last 5 years. He was effectively saying there is a secret and occult network of very, very high level businessmen, intelligence figures, fascists who, under the auspices of anti-fascism, are setting up an authoritarian state and doing these massacres and blaming the left for it. And I mean, he wasn't at all wrong. And at the time, he was also writing this lengthy kind of sort of um, pornographic uh, fiction novel about these figures who were easily identifiable as some of the most intriguing, right-wing gray eminences of the period, called Petrolio, focusing really on the energy industry, which was a real hotbed, both of workers, wildcat autonomous activity and of coordinated repression thereof. So he was writing a book that was very plainly, very limpidly a a loosely veiled expose and or a thinly veiled expose. And he wrote this column pointing a big finger, a quivering finger, right? And then he turns up dead on the Idroscolo, the on basically like the beach, as you said at Ostia, where he was beaten to death by we're not necessarily sure who. The original story was that he went there with a ragazzo, with like a teenage guy, who he picked up near the train station. Um, and, you know, there was an immediate question as to whether that guy beat him up or whether a group like a gang of hoods like followed them there and then dragged him out and beat him up. And then the guy he had taken there drove away in a panic in Pasolini's car, driving over his corpse along the way. Um, and then there's, from there, a kind of like fractal pattern of conspiracy theories about who the people were who beat him up. Like the journalists who arrived on the scene interviewed witnesses who said that they saw, three or four people beating up this guy and that he was screaming for help, and so it's like, there's a kind of a strain that goes from there that suggests that some of the people who were beating him up were involved in the mafia. And of course, around this time in 75, the Banda della Maliana, which becomes omnipresent by the end of the 70s, is just emerging from, parts of Testaccio and Ostia, right? So they are like these guys who beat up and killed Pasolini may have been involved in a sort of mafia operation that was kind of integrated into a state security complex. And so that's sort of the end of the road where you don't know whether, Pasolini was beaten up by a gang of homophobes, who just, knew exactly what he was doing or whatever. Or whether he was beat up by a hit squad of like mafiosi, charged with and that the kid he picked up was charged with the task of basically leading him into his death, right? So there's a lot of different questions that arise when you talk about how and why Pasolini was killed.
There are, yeah, yeah, and it's interesting because, it's of the same ilk in many ways as all the other violent things that happened in the years of lead, but at the same time, it's a far more individualized violent incident because obviously, the death of one guy on the beaches of Ostia. But at the same time, it fits into that whole continuum of very violent, murky incidents that happened at that time. So people can listen to your episode on that, on Pasolini and his death, on the Years of Lead podcast. I myself wrote a little script for John Lordan's Seriously Mysterious podcast. You can you can listen to that too if you want. It's really good. John Lordan's podcast and yours is too. So on that note, what exactly would you say? Do you think that the whole sort of stay behind network stuff, before we finish up, the stay behind networks you mentioned earlier, which are kind of a sort of a characteristic of the whole years of lead thing, um, were they happening in places like Turkey during the Cold War or afterwards? Because I mean that's something that I briefly read somewhere, I think in a book or something, but I haven't really like looked into it. Are you familiar with any of that, or?
Yeah, so there's one author who I forget if they're French. I want to say that it's a French author who made a lot of the stay behind networks and connected it to this thing called Operation Gladio, later to become the Gladio Council in the 1960s, and sort of extrapolated from that Italian experience a general pattern, which certainly did exist around Europe and also in Turkey, of these kinds of secret paramilitary organizations um, allegedly organized to rise up in the event of a communist invasion or takeover, right? Um, and as to whether or not the sort of stay behind networks that emerged in Italy or were organized in Italy um, were actually a kind of a cookie cutter mold that was also applied in West Germany and Turkey. I'm not sure. I don't know. I know that the the West German example is more kind of um it seems more analogous because it really does involve a lot of former Nazis who were kind of grandfathered into the new security apparatus of the Bundesnachrichtendienst, um, which was their kind of CIA under Reinhard Gehlen. Um, but I'm not as familiar with the Turkish um scenario. And I want to kind of highlight that like recent research indicates that the Gladio networks are actually their influence and import is overstated. In
I
fact,
see.
the United States was trying to get the Italian secret services to utilize the Gladio stay behind networks more than they actually did. And when pressed, the Italian secret services tended to ignore. um, the really kind of effective operations influenced, fielded, and yeah, or rather influenced and to some extent materially supported by the United States were actually under the domain of the Pentagon and not the CIA. So the stay behinds are kind of in this sort of like blurry area where there was real kind of direct engagement with coup plotters. Like if you look at for example, the Rosa dei Venti network in 73, 74, it did involve veterans groups. And when you're talking about like veterans of the resistance, you can go, one of two ways. Some some of those veteran groups are just plainly fascist organizations, like the Stahlhelm and stuff like that.
Hmm.
And so it is clear that there were like former fascist, anti-partisan veterans organizations who were involved in um, coup plotting in the mid 70s, and it is, I would say, likely that they were overlapping with these stay behind networks, which also included, monarchist former partisans and actually anti-fascist former partisans. However, again, the actual sort of structure of Gladio um, was is has been overstated in terms of its import. And so my thoughts on the Turkish scenario, I would like if I was to research that, I would do it with a fair amount of skepticism.
I see. Yeah, no, that's good. And so, in terms of, have you seen the BBC documentary from the 90s, directed by Alan Frankovitch,
Yeah,
who's an interesting filmmaker? Yeah, did you see that one about
NATO's
Gladio?
secret armies, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I couldn't remember the name of it. Yeah, what did you think of that?
I mean, it seems to me it's a very interesting documentary. It focuses on Gladio, which
Yeah,
I think in retrospect it would have done well to have focused more on the complexity of interlocking networks beyond Gladio, which is what I try to do in my podcast. Um, but they they do a pretty impressive job of interviewing people who were actually involved in the Italian Secret Services. If I remember correctly, they interviewed Gianadelio Maletti, former director of the Servizio Informazione Difesa, the military intelligence. I think that they interview Umberto D'Amato, who had been the Office of Confidential Affairs
right.
head, and also apparently an informant for the CIA, because of
Huh.
course, the CIA. wants a very clear picture of what Italian intelligence is doing. And so they are actively working to have members, high-ranking members of the Italian Secret Services give them information that they shouldn't actually be sharing, even with their partners. Um, and who else? And I think that they also interview
Licio
Seravigle.
jelly.
They interview Jelly. Wow.
Yeah.
What
Licio jelly is for those in who's Licio jelly? Could you
Italian.
describe who he is briefly?
Alicio Jelly is just a slippery guy. It's really difficult to describe him. He during the years of the resistance, he carried two cards. One was the card of the fascists, and the other was the Communist Party. So if he gets stopped by a fascist, he's safe, and he gets stopped by partisans, he's safe, right? That's
Yeah.
basically the story of Jelly's life. He's chameleonic, and he engages in business in Argentina and Italy. It's very clear that he is a hardcore fascist, you might say spiritually, but he's also a pragmatist when it comes to business, as it were. Um, and he just sort of develops over time these interesting affiliations, associations with other Italian businessmen, political figures, obviously Secret Service operatives and officers, military officers, high-level military officers, through an organization called Propaganda Due, which was initially kind of a secret Masonic lodge, which was led in the late 60s, early 70s by Eugenio Cefis, who had been a figure deeply immersed in Italian industry, but also surveillance. Cefis was the person that Pasolini was calling out in Petrolio. He allegedly was behind the killing of his predecessor at the state oil company, and then he went on to head up the major petrochemical firm Monte Edison, which of course was working in the Venetian Porto Marghera. Um, and there's a whole story about the fight of workers against horrible conditions in their refineries and factories there. So Chafis is sort of like this really shady figure, and he's the head of Propaganda Due. But then when he goes over to Monte Edison, he leaves his position at Propaganda Due, and Licio Gelli takes it over. And so with Jelly comes this other network of sort of CIA linked financial gray eminences and mob linked, really kind of driven by a mob linked accountant, tax attorney, whatever. I call him a fixer. His name is Michele Sindona from Sicily.
Yeah.
And so Jelly, Michele Sidona, and the Banco Ambrosiano guy, Roberto Calvi, create this whole mirror game, this whole, building of mirrors um, in Propaganda Due, through Propaganda Due, and their immense international network of shell companies, um, and they committed huge amounts of fraud, also laundering drug money for the Sicilian mafia, and really running kind of a blackmail market for the people who are members of Propaganda Due. They had files on a lot of people, and their main kind of imperative was a sort of like a rebirth of Italy program, to construct a state of order, to clamp down on the left, and to do this, most more or less through the strategy of tension. So I wouldn't necessarily say, well, I don't know. It's complicated to say that like Propaganda Due was behind all the coup efforts that were going on in the 1970s, 1960s, 1970s. I mean, it would be maybe a step too far to say that they were the real puppet masters of everything, but they were
Yeah.
certainly integrally intertwined in pretty much every episode, of mass killing and political far right extremism, certainly throughout the whole period. It's really incredible to learn about Jelly's whole career arc because he he gets his villa gets raided and his whole operation gets exposed. His enterprise crashes and burns. He has to move into exile. But, as if by a miracle, he kind of manages to avoid substantial jail time, as is true of a lot of these people who committed atrocious acts throughout this period. There's this always sort of aura of impunity, of extraordinarily frustrating impunity that just sort of follows these disgraceful figures throughout the whole period, despite the fact that a lot of them spend a good amount of their time miserable, on the run, exiled, all of these kinds of things. So it's like, I don't know. There are a lot of really weird kind of, I don't know, almost like morality plays, which are mixed with um and really, I don't know, these sort of like mythical figures, commedia dell'arte, kind of like like epics. I don't know.
Tragedia dell'arte. Tragedia
Yeah,
del. Yeah,
yeah.
it's
I don't
yeah.
know. There's so much intrigue, right? And that's
Yeah.
part of the reason why I got into this time in history because I get tired of living in a condition where all of the same stuff is happening in the present, you know, because it's like, look at Trump. I mean, Trump just sort of like as just the trials, they like pile up, all these convictions. He gets called the Teflon Don, right? Because, throughout his whole life, he's had all of this aura of impunity that's kind of followed him around. Um, and I mean, there's some really fascinating stuff about the Sicilian mafia's interest in Atlantic City, and these are interesting kind of things to explore and study. It's often said that it's not conspiracy necessarily. It's the fact that like terrible people tend to attract one another.
Yeah.
They just kind of they just kind
Yeah.
of do and they hang out and they do things together. It's not like they all convene in smoke-filled rooms and plot out exactly what they're going to do in the future. Most of it is just absolute buffoonery, just
Yeah.
watching them constantly fail and get put in front of trials and many of them spend long periods of time in jail and they get completely disgraced. But there's also like there are all these rise and fall narratives. There are all of these kinds of like, how did that person get so much money, and power? How did they accumulate so much power? And then how did they lose it? And yet, how did they escape the most important consequences for their activities? But a lot of them don't. Roberto Calvi, ends up hanging from Blackfriar Bridge. Sindona ends up killing himself with arsenic coffee. in jail. So,
Yeah, and if anyone watches films like The Godfather Part 3, you'll see all the kind of influence that these some of these incidents from the years of lead had on, like, some very uh I don't know, was part three necessarily terribly popular, but you know what I mean. Famous films and novels and things like that. Roberto Calvi. I mean, it talk to anyone from the 80s, either in America, Ireland, England, wherever, Italy, and they'll probably remember. Oh yeah, that time that the Italian businessman was found hanging from a bridge in London. If you talk to
yeah.
people in my family remember that. I'm sure people in your family remember it too. Yeah, it's a very, very weird series of unfortunate events the years have led. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that the thing that sticks with most people about Calvi's death in particular is, and it's called, the Vatican Bank scandal by
Yeah.
a lot of people because these networks were deeply enmeshed in the Vatican Bank. And the Vatican Bank was being investigated, not just by Italian authorities who were trying to follow the tracks of Sindona and Calvi, but also by the United States FBI, which was following the tracks of securities fraud being carried out by the Gambino family, I want to say, in the US. And it was really kind of like all roads led to the Vatican. Very interesting.
Very interesting. Very interesting indeed.
And the
Well,
Vatican Bank, there's still some really interesting scholarship and reporting that's being done about the Vatican Bank because they've cleaned up a lot of their operations since that period, but not all. And a lot of their functions are still pretty obscure. And yeah, there's some interesting recent books about what they've been up to. I don't know.
any in particular you can recommend? Because it'd be interesting.
Let me see. I mean, I saw like an interview with the author who was writing a new book about the Vatican Bank.
You ever read the books by Philip Willan? I believe he wrote for, was it The Guardian? Or something. He wrote a couple of books about the years of lead and also about the Vatican during that period. I don't know if you ever came across him.
I don't remember. I don't remember if I have. I think Gerald Posner, who
Gerald
wrote
Posner.
he wrote God's Bankers, um, maybe 10 years ago, which is sort of famous, I guess. But that's like a broad sweep of the history of the Vatican Bank.
Yeah.
Um, there's a really good book um, about the Vatican Bank scandal. If I have it on my wall, I'll be able to point to it, but I'm not sure if I have it here. Um, I don't see it. Huh. I wonder where I put it.
We can we can have a little look at it later sometime. The well,
I do
before
see now
we
that the darkest side of politics is the Jeffrey Bale book, not the darkest side of history. It's the darkest side of politics.
Okay, the darkest side of politics, Jeffrey Bell's brilliant. So obviously, I'd encourage people to read that. I'd encourage people to listen to your podcast. Where can people find you, first of all? Like, what platforms? Where can people listen to your podcast?
Oh, here we go. Richard Hammer's Vatican Connection would be the an interesting book about it's the subtitle is The Astonishing Account of a $1 billion Counterfeit Stock Deal Between the Mafia and the Church.
Oh,
Um,
that
yeah.
sounds complicated, but that sounds interesting. Yeah, okay. And
It's
what's the name of the author?
Richard Hammer.
Richard Hammond. Okay,
Yeah.
brilliant.
He wrote it with Joseph Coffey Jr., who I think is the son. No, I think Joseph Coffey Jr. was actually involved in the bust.
Oh,
for the FBI.
wow.
So it's a cool book.
Yeah, no, I'd say so, yeah. You're going to need plenty of coffee reading books about these financial shenanigans. I mean, certainly it can get quite complicated, and you need to keep the old brain going. When I do anyway, I don't really understand numbers very well. Anyway, where can people find your podcast? What platforms is the Years of Lead pod on?
I don't know. I think it should be pretty much everywhere.
Okay.
You know, wherever you find your podcasts.
Are you on Twitter or social media like that as well?
I am personally, I haven't, I kind of abandoned the Twitter account for the podcasts, when Elon Musk took over the site, just because I abhor having more than one podcast, more than one account on his site. Um, so my Twitter is A Reid Ross, AReidRoss.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much indeed. Terribly interesting topic, one that, I think deserves a lot more attention. And it's great that you have your podcast for, people such as myself, native English speakers who I don't speak Italian very well. So it's good having your podcast to kind of fill me in on what happened during that awful time. So thank you very much and have a good evening.
Oh, absolutely. You too.